Okay, so I almost never buy plants at big box stores, and the main reason why is because I feel like a lot of their growers have to operate at such a huge scale in order to supply those big box stores and be at the price points that they want, that they are just going ham on the pesticides and the herbicides and on the chemical fertilizers. And I don't want to do all of this work and take someone's hard-earned money to build them an organic garden, a pollinator bed, or anything like that, and then take plants that have been grown in such an environment so inorganically and put them into the nice soil and the environment that this client wants. You know, they want to make sure that they're not getting any toxins, that their kids aren't getting any toxins from these different pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers, and so I want to make sure that that's the case for them. And so another reason I almost never buy plants at a big box store is because the local nurseries, the smaller nurseries, they have better selection of the kinds of plants that I want, and the pricing is usually better. I also feel better about supporting a small business and just giving my money to them, and it's going to stay more in my community. So also when you shop at a small nursery, you're just going to get better service. I mean, a lot of the people there are very knowledgeable. They're really excited to work with you and help you find the plants that you need and help you make decisions about where to put the plant and how to work with it in your garden. Whereas if you're at a big box store, you know, who knows if the person working in that section has any passion whatsoever for plants. So this is vetiver grass. It's a non-native, but it's a really neat plant. Super thick roots. It's one of my favorite smells, the essential oils that can get made from it, and it filters water. So I'm going to use this for my gray water filtration system. It is frost sensitive, so it does die back to the roots and can die altogether in the wintertime. So you've got to take care of this one when it gets really cold, but I'm going to do that. So vetiver grass. One more thing about this, I actually had a client out southeast of Austin who was using this. She was surrounding areas that she needed to keep gophers out of, and the roots are so thick that they were keeping the gophers out of those areas. And I've also seen them used for really steep slope erosion control, stabilization in more of like a civil engineering context. All right, so this is a root beer plant, and it is, as far as I know, it's a native plant here to Texas, or it has some ranges here in Texas. It's definitely not an invasive problem plant, although it kind of looks like one. It looks like elephant ear. So it has these big, soft leaves, and it grows, likes to have a lot of moisture, and it's got that smell of kind of sassafras or root beer smell, so it's got that flavoring. And what people can do is they take these big leaves, and they get much bigger than this when the plant is full grown, and you can wrap a whole fish in it, and then you can cook the fish in this leaf, and it gives it some nice flavoring. It can also act as your plate. All right, so this is an asparagus plant, and these are after the little spears have leafed out, they become this fern, and these are young plants, so it takes 2 to 3 years for this to get fully established, and they actually can get to be like 6 feet tall and have this nice soft fern and these beautiful red berries on it. So actually the asparagus plant is super cool because it's a perennial. It's also an amazing food plant, but then it has this very rare kind of soft ferny texture that you don't get in Texas very often. Yeah, so these Mexican honeysuckle plants they can become a really nice big bush. I have noticed they can be a little hard to establish, and I haven't quite pinpointed exactly why, but I do know that this is a plant that says full sun. One of the things about plants that say full sun, they'd still like a little bit of afternoon shade. So give it enough room, make sure it gets at least 6 hours of sunlight, but probably not like the full freaking 12 hours of sunlight that you could give it in midsummer. And I've seen this run be really good for attracting hummingbirds, but it can get to be like 3 to 5 feet wide, 3 to 5 feet tall, so it can get really big. All right, so this is bicolor iris, and it's a native iris plant, and irises are, once they're established, they're really hardy, and they can start to create these little clumps and sort of naturalize and spread out. But I really like this one. It gets like 4 or 5 feet tall when it's fully established, and then it puts on beautiful blooms in the early summer. And I think what I like about it is its growth habit and just the way that it looks more like kind of a hybrid between a grass and a reed. And so it holds a certain aesthetic place in the garden that's very unique compared to a lot of the native plants that are available. All right, this Artemisia is one of my favorite native plants, and it's just because it is so hardy and it spreads really fast. So 1 gallon like this can cover like a 3 foot by 3 foot area over the course of a year or two, depending on what kind of weather we get and what kind of fertility you have. This is one of the only plants that I've seen actually outcompete Bermuda grass and be able to hold that space and fight the Bermuda grass back. So for spaces where you're really dealing with a lot of grass and trying to transition away from turf and lawn, can be one of your best allies right here. It also has medicinal qualities. It's antiviral, antifungal, just sort of a general like microbe reducing plant. It smells really good too, and it looks good throughout the whole year. All right, so Purple Heart is becoming one of my favorite plants here recently, especially for an understory underneath fruit trees plant, because it creates a really nice living mulch, and it doesn't look like it because it's so soft and kind of watery on the inside, but this thing is so drought tolerant, and it just spreads, and you can eat the flowers and you can eat the tips of it, so it is also edible. I do think you need to protect this one from the deer is the only thing. It's not very deer tolerant, whereas like Artemisia is super deer tolerant. Mistflower, the Greg's Mistflower is absolutely one of my favorite native plants, and this one occupies more of a ground cover, so it only gets about 12 inches tall, and then it just starts to spread like crazy. It is covered in butterflies through most of the summertime, and it's a really consistent bloomer, and it blooms for a very long time, and it just can cover a lot of ground and hold a lot of space, but then you can still grow other things over it and nearby to it since it's more of a ground cover. It says full sun, again, 6 to 8 hours, not 10 to 12 hours is really the preference here. Greg was a guy that, and Salvia Gregi and Greg's Mistflower, so this was a botanist who was going around Texas very early on and naming all the plants after himself, so that's fun. So now we get to say, you know, Greg's Mistflower, Greg's Salvia, this and that. I imagine there were like 3 or 4 of these dudes running around like competing to see how many plants they could get their name into. So, okay, so Fragrant Mistflower, not to be confused with Greg's Mistflower. This is much more of a shrub. These can actually get pretty big. They can get like 6 feet tall, 6 feet wide. I've seen them that big. This does also attract a lot of butterflies, different varieties, and takes longer to get established. But beautiful native plant, just can become a much bigger shrub, so account for that. All right, so this Blackfoot daisy is a really hardy native plant. You can put it in some of the roughest conditions, and you'll find it out there hiking in some of the roughest conditions. It'll typically survive. I think with this one, you actually have to be careful about giving it too much care because you could kill it from overwatering. All right, so this bulbine is a really beautiful plant, and it's very similar to like native alliums and other stuff like that in its growth habit, but it's a little smaller, beautiful blooms. And you can get them from a lot of the native plant stores, or usually in the native plant section. I've bought these for projects before, and I believe that they actually have come from Africa and they've just been popularized here, and they can do really well some years, but whenever we get a hard freeze, they do tend to die back to the ground, and even the roots can die back. So I haven't had a lot of success getting them to naturalize. So if you're going to try to grow this bulbine, I would recommend that you grow it in a pot, or that you're ready to cover it with frost cloth if we're going to get a hard freeze. All right, so this is Copper Canyon Daisy, and this is actually one of the most full sun plants that I've ever encountered here in Texas that isn't like a cactus or a succulent. It has an amazing smell. At least I love it. It's kind of polarizing. You either love it or you hate it. Really consistent blooms through the summertime. Tends to attract bees and bumblebees more than butterflies and hummingbirds. And it says it can get to be 6 feet high and 6 feet wide. I think that's pretty rare. That mostly depends on, you know, having like ideal conditions. So this is Mexican oregano, and so it's actually like a more wild version of oregano that the cultivars are coming from. It's got a little bit more of like a peppery smell, but you can absolutely use it in a culinary or a medicinal application. And it's just going to be a little bit more hardy and easier to establish, and it has a little bit more of a bush habit. And it has beautiful pink flowers, so it actually tends to focus a little bit more on the blooms and seeding than on the herbaceous growth like your culinary rosemaries you can buy are going to do. So this is a Texas lantana, and Dylan, you were sharing that you were having a hard time getting these to establish. I've seen these naturalized out in all sorts of hill country landscapes, and it's often one of the plants that's surviving when a property is completely overgrazed because the animals don't like it. What's interesting about native plants is you're transitioning them from an unnatural environment in a pot where they're getting watered 2 or 3 times a day into a natural environment. And so you're walking this tightrope between needing to water them enough for them to get established in your native soil, but not watering them too much now that they're in an environment that has less drainage than the potting soil. So a lot of times I think we actually overwater and kill the plants. But sometimes we go too far the other direction and we underwater, and because it's in this well-drained potting soil, the roots dry out before they have a chance to get out into the native soil. So when we're talking about buying a smaller plant or a bigger plant, I usually will favor the smaller plant myself. A lot of times it gives the plant, because it's younger, it has a better ability to adapt to its new conditions. and I'll just buy more of them. So if this one costs 2 or 3 times as much, I'll just go ahead and spend that same amount of money on the smaller plant and plant more of them. And then that way I get to cover more area, or I get more biodiversity if I buy a couple more smaller plants instead of just one. And then it'll grow into that size if I take good care of it. Chili patines, this is one of my favorite shade-tolerant native plants. And it is actually the mother of all pepper plants. So any hot pepper or bell pepper that you eat came from the chili patine. They do produce really small red peppers, and they are very spicy. I'm quite sensitive to spice though. The birds love it because the birds don't respond to that heat. And so you'll see the songbirds just coming in really loving these things. And they can be a little tricky to get established. And so I've actually planted quite a few that haven't survived. So just keep a close eye on it through establishment. Once it's established, it'll be just fine. All right, so we've got a bunch of different salvias here. So these are plants that are commonly called sage plants, different kinds of sage plants. A lot of them have really interesting blooms, and that's why there's been so many varieties cultivated over time. And a lot of these were just natively evolved through different environments. So indigo spire salvia, what's really cool about this one is it tends to be a biennial, so it'll live for 2 or 3 years in most cases. It'll get really big really fast. So I've seen this thing get 4 or 5 feet tall in one season in the right conditions. And this one specifically attracts bumblebees. Salvia is this mealy blue sage, kind of a weird name, but this one is the one that I find the most out naturalized in the hill country. So I think this is actually one of the hardiest salvia species that you can get. And it's got light blue blooms. And this one also tends to attract bumblebees, but also does a lot of good forage value for the honeybees and native bees. So this is the tropical red salvia, and I really love this one. The blooms are so beautiful, and the hummingbirds love it. That deep red color attracts hummingbirds. And I have seen this naturalize and survive, especially a little further south and a little further east of Austin. I have found that out here in the hill country, it tends to freeze back in the wintertime and sometimes can die in the roots as well. So just be ready to protect this one if you plant it west of I-35. So this plant is, the way I think of it is cenizo, but it's also called Texas sage or green Texas sage or convent sage. There's a lot of different cultivars and a lot of different common names for this plant. You can also call it rain sage. Cool thing about this plant is it's super drought tolerant, and it tends to bloom when there's a big shift in barometric pressure. So right before we get a rain in the summertime when we haven't for a while, a lot of times this will start blooming, and then I'll check my weather app and I'll be like, oh cool, it says it's gonna rain in a few days. And the sage kind of like knew before I did. And sometimes when there isn't rain on the forecast, this thing will bloom and it'll give like a little shower. And I'm always like, wow, the sage knew, how cool. So cenizo is one of the best full sun plants, and it can actually get to be 8 feet wide, 8 feet tall. It can live for 10 plus years, and it's got beautiful purple blooms sporadically throughout the summertime and in the spring and in the fall as well. All right, so we got the Yopon holly here, one of my favorite native plants. It is the only plant native to North America that has caffeine in its leaves. You guys have probably seen the Yopon tea, and it just makes really great hedge and privacy screen plantings. Everyone is always interested in what to use for privacy screen plantings. Sometimes it'll lose its leaves, but many of our winters it stays completely evergreen. And what's not to love about it? Beautiful red berries. So this is an Arizona cypress tree, not to be confused with the Montezuma or the bald cypress, because this is actually a dryland conifer tree. And this is one of the best for privacy screen plantings. And they can get tall, they can get to be 20 feet tall, they can get to be 15 feet wide. And so this is really one of the best native plants for privacy screens. We use them a lot in that context. All right, so we've got these mountain laurel trees here. Of course, everyone knows that smell. It's almost like grape Kool-Aid or something like that you get in the springtime when these bloom. Really great evergreen privacy screen plant. However, it grows very, very slowly. Sometimes like an inch, 2 inches a year, whereas a lot of plants are growing a foot to 2 feet a year. So just be aware of that when you're working with mountain laurels in a privacy screen setting. So Texas persimmon is another good tree for privacy screening. You can see it's semi-deciduous, so it's lost its leaves this year because we did have some weather down in the teens, but it's starting to leaf out now. And a lot of years this is fully evergreen. Our winters are pretty short here, so even if it does lose its leaves, it's only going to be for 2 or 3 months at the most. And then of course it produces food that we can eat and food that the wildlife loves, and it doesn't get too big, so it kind of fits into more of a space where you want to have things limited to a height of 10, 12 feet, something like that. Yeah, so evergreen sumac is one of my favorite privacy screen plantings. Really beautiful evergreen tree, and it produces berries that have a coating on them that are high in vitamin C, and they give you that kind of citrusy flavor, so you can make kind of sumac-ade. And just a really beautiful native plant that's super hardy but also evergreen. All right, so when we're talking about vines, that's a really great way to create more green in a space vertically and create shade if you're growing it over a trellis. Some of my favorites are crossvine. So this grows really fast and it's pretty aggressive, but it's not so aggressive and strong that it's gonna like tear down the trellis that you planted on. Really consistent blooms through the summertime. Not to be confused with trumpet vine. Trumpet vine is a little too aggressive in my experience. Star jasmine, really beautiful smell, can be hard to get established, but this one's nice because it's evergreen as well. Not native technically, but not invasive either. My favorite actually is the coral honeysuckle. And I'm not seeing that right here in this selection right now. I know they're getting a plant order in right now, but coral honeysuckle is evergreen and it's native, and it grows a little bit more slowly. It's not as aggressive. You don't have to worry about it like climbing up and taking over the world too fast. On the other hand, Texas wisteria is such an aggressive grower that you kind of have to be careful about where you plant this one. I have seen it climb up into 50-foot tall eastern red cedar trees and actually start to kill those trees. So just watch out for this one, especially east of I-35. I think west of I-35, because the conditions are drier and the soil is poorer, you can kind of plant this one. And even like I'm experimenting with growing Texas wisteria up a cedar tree to see if I can get it to look like when the wisteria is blooming, the cedar is actually blooming with these beautiful, almost like grape clusters. All right, so this is a goji berry plant, aka wolfberry, and these can do really well in Texas. They're pretty drought tolerant, and the thing with these is that the berries don't taste very good fresh off of the bush, oddly enough. They have more flavor when they're dry. They're just kind of bland fresh off of the bush. These do tend to grow in a bit of a sprawling, kind of messy habit, so just be aware of that. They don't need a trellis, but they are a little bit floppy and they kind of spread out. All right, so thornless blackberries, we planted these a lot in the food forest environment, and it's really hit or miss, honestly, with the blackberries. Sometimes they do great, sometimes they just die right away. So we're still trying to dial that in, but there's the native dewberry, which is the thorny variety of blackberry that grows out here naturalized in all sorts of environments. So we know it's possible, and when they have done well, they've just taken off and gone gangbusters. Of course, planting a thornless variety is recommended, and you're going to have to protect them from the deer because that's what the thorns do for the native variety, and you are going to have to trellis them if you want to be able to harvest easily. Interesting thing about blackberries is they're really easy to propagate from cuttings, so you can just cut a branch and stick it in a pot and it'll most likely root out. They only produce berries on last year's growth, so that means that they grow for 1 year and then they produce a berry, and so the way that you prune the blackberries and work with them in that regard is going to have a big effect on what kind of harvest you get from year to year. Figs. So I've come across a lot of figs and like old farmhouses that are 50 years old, and they're huge. They're almost as big as the house. So they start small, they're easy to propagate, they grow quickly, they can freeze back. Once they get to a certain size, even though they might freeze back, typically they'll grow back to the same size in one season. So figs in the right environment are a huge winner for Texas. They can be super drought tolerant. And of course, whatever you don't get of the fruit yourself, the wildlife is just going to love. So I'm actually a huge fan of loquats. There's a lot of them in Austin that are fully established, and I plant them on almost every project and everywhere that I go. Because I had these where I was living when we went through the snowpocalypse, I was able to witness them survive through that and just get covered in ice and snow and keep pulling through. Some of the leaves did die back, but these things were hardy enough to survive what's probably the hardest freeze on record for Texas, the hardest and longest. So loquats are a big winner in my book. The interesting thing is they flower in the fall, and then they get pollinated, and they have to hold those flowers through the winter, and then they fruit in the spring, in early spring. Yeah, I mean, I've been one of the most hopeful, stubborn people on the blueberry front, and I have bought and planted many of them, and I've never quite gotten them to survive. And I think the main reason is that they really prefer acidic soil, and out here in limestone-based soils, and watering with well water that's coming out of a limestone aquifer. We basically got alkaline tea that we're pouring on the plants, and so they never seem to make it beyond a year or so. In one case, we built raised beds and we made sure that the soil was acidic enough, and the plants were doing great, but ultimately they were getting watered with well water, and so they didn't survive beyond a year. I think that if you are going to succeed with blueberries, you need to have them in a raised bed. You need to control the pH of the soil that you put in there. You need to water them with rainwater only so that you know that pH is neutral or slightly acidic. If anyone else has had success with blueberries, comment, let us know what you did. So mulberry, you guys have probably heard me talk about this one already. It's my favorite tree. I'm sort of like Jonny Appleseed, but with mulberries and without the land grab thing going on. So mulberries, plant them everywhere. This is a dwarfing variety because they do grow super fast and they can actually get to be a big shade tree. So if you're not using a dwarfing variety, keep that in mind. But my philosophy is plant as many mulberries as possible. Lots of genetic diversity. It is a native tree, and the wildlife benefits from it. And of course, your kids are going to love to climb up in that tree and eat the berries fresh. All right, pomegranates, especially cold hardy pomegranates. There's a lot of varieties from like Russia that are more cold hardy, make a lot of sense for us here in Central Texas. This can also be a really good privacy screen plant because they can get to be big and they can be trained into a hedge. Of course, they do go dormant in the wintertime. Beautiful big red blossoms and beautiful fruit. Okay, so we just looked for tomatoes in the vegetable section and they don't have them yet. And I think that's actually quite wise of this kind of smaller nursery to not have them out yet, because we're pretty far west of I-35. And so it gets colder here at night than it does in Austin or east of I-35. In Austin, there's the heat island effect, and then east there's just more humidity and more cover. And so it tends to stay a little bit more insulated over there. So technically the last frost date for west of I-35 is mid-March, but it's also been known to freeze as late as April 1st or very early April. They call it an April Fool's freeze. All right, hey, thanks guys. Appreciate you watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you want to learn more about what we do, how we do it, why we do it, you can hop over to our website. There's tons of good articles. You can join our newsletter. You can follow us on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. We'd love to see you there and answer your questions. Thanks again. Enjoy.